Welcome back to Buckeye Talk. It is part 2 of the Ultimate Ohio State Draft. If you have not listened to part 1, stop and go back and do that. Doug Lamarice, Nathan Baird, Stephen Means. We are taking the 90 first-round picks in Ohio State history and making a first round out of them. 32 first-rounders. We drafted 16 players yesterday, and we did that in this order. Orlando Pace, Chase Young, Justin Fields, Joey Bosa, Nick Bosa, Denzel Ward. See, go back and listen. I'm ruining the whole draft if you haven't listened to it. Seriously, stop. If you're like, Ultimate Ohio State Draft, I'm ruining it. Stop. Denzel Ward, 6. John Hicks, 7. Dan Wilkinson, Corey Stringer, Sean Springs, CJ Stroud, Ezekiel Elliott, Jim Parker, Jeff Okuda, Tom Cousineau, Jack Tatum. Those are the first 16. We just can't do a 4-hour pod, although we could. So we cut it in half, and we are now ready to begin. Oh, we could. Is that a challenge?
No, I just want that on. That is on the record now.
Podcast?
No, he said we can't do a 4-hour podcast. He said it. We're gonna get it bronze. We're gonna get like a plaque made.
Strike it from the record. No, strike it.
Part of me does want to have
24-hour podcast marathon still on the docket eventually.
I wouldn't say that. I do wonder how long we could actually go. If you just picked out a bunch of rapid fire, how many could we actually go before somebody's just like, can we wrap this up, please? I just want to go live my life.
Who would be the somebody, though? Like a listener or one of the podcasters?
I think Nathan would be the first to be like, and it'd probably be about 3:45, and you start to see it in his face, and then maybe about 30 minutes later, he's just like, I just don't want to be here anymore.
Nathan gets that look sometimes 17 minutes into a podcast. So yeah.
4 hours.
Try to give you some benefit of the doubt there, okay?
I can remember the first podcast meeting we ever had as a sports staff at cleveland.com, and we were sort of talking about it because there were some other people in Cleveland who were doing sports podcasts, and cleveland.com wasn't doing them. And I was one of the people, Landis was one of the people, we were like, we got to be doing these. And somebody was like, what do we do? Like, how do you do this? What would we do? And I said, I could do 3 hours tomorrow. And like, so and I'm not saying it'd be good, but I'm saying I could do it. So I don't know that I would ever stop. So if it could be a solo podcast, it could go for 24 hours. So go back and listen, go back, because this won't make sense if you don't listen to part 1. And I do think part 1 was fun. We are going to pick up with pick number 17. We have the remaining 74 players on the board still. Again, Ohio State's 91st round picks is the most in college football history. They lead in that, which is kind of why we're doing this. Man, there's so many options, and we are thinking as modern NFL GMs. So, without further ado, I had the first pick in the draft, but we, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I made the 16th pick of Jack Tatum. Nathan, this is one of those, right? It's like the start of the second round of the NFL draft overnight. People think about things. It's always like, is there a player that somebody really wants that people are trying to trade up for? Was there somebody that when we got to the end of the 16, like as you thought about this, that you were like, I know exactly who the 17th pick is going to be? I almost think, I can't believe this guy's still on the board.
It's the next guy on my list, and I did jostle my list a little bit right before we recorded yesterday, and it was right around this juncture of the draft. And this is a guy that I thought might be gone by now. I mean, to familiarize people, if you don't want to go back and listen to the first episode, which I highly recommend, or if you did and you just forgot, we're basically drafting from the modern NFL perspective, and we're drafting based on how these players were perceived at the time they left Ohio State. So, not drafting the way that they were drafted, not thinking the way that they were drafted in 1972 or 1993, but also not taking into account how they actually end up doing in the NFL. It's more about what the prospect they were. So we're halfway through the first round, and I think if it were the modern NFL, it would be very unusual that no receiver has come off the board in the first half of the NFL draft, especially when you consider that Ohio State has been cranking out receivers year after year, first-round receivers now for the last couple of years. And you can even go back into the 90s and find first-round receivers that this program was putting out, guys who went on to have long NFL careers. But if I'm basing this on the current thinking, which of these guys, the past first-round picks in Ohio State history, is the best top-to-bottom NFL draft prospect. That's what I'm going to take here. So with the 17th pick of the Ohio State all-time draft, Nathan Baird selects Garrett Wilson, wide receiver.
Why do y'all hate me so much? I agree with this pick wholeheartedly. This is actually where I was going to go with my pick for a lot of that same reason. And I actually have some research here. Ohio State's only had 2 receivers be wide receiver 1 in their draft class, and they were both in years where wide receivers didn't come off the board until late. And it was San Antonio Holmes in 2006, and it's Jackson Smith-Njigba this year. And both of those guys went in the 20s. So it's when you look, it's like, I think when you think about perception, the first thing you go to, okay, who was just the first guy taken off the board as position? But that only works typically when that position goes in the top 10 because there's an abundance of them. There wasn't really a high-end wide receiver classes in neither one of those classes. So now you go to classes where maybe a guy was a top 10 pick, but he was wide receiver 2 because wide receiver 1 went 8 and above. And you've got guys like Joey Galloway, you've got Ted Ginn Jr., you've got Garrett Wilson in those situations. And now you start to go with how were they perceived? Ted Ginn Jr., Joey Galloway, those guys were never going to be wide receiver 1 in their respective years just because of who they were in the classes with. Garrett Wilson was probably perceived as wide receiver 1 by at least 50% of teams. And then there were teams who thought Drake London was wide receiver 1, like the Atlanta Falcons.
When it's receivers, Steven is like, I dove face first into piles of research. It's like, hey, how's your tackle research? Steve's like, I reached into a grab bag and read a name off of a slip of paper that I pulled out. But receiver research, because I did that same research, it is interesting. Because I thought, oh, wait, maybe they haven't had a receiver 1 because their guys in the top 10 were not receiver 1. And as you said, Steven, it's kind of weird how it worked out. So this is going to allow us to have a very interesting Ohio State receiver discussion when it comes to draft prospects. During the course of the last 2 years, we've had a lot of discussions on here, like the Jackson Smith-Njigba is like the next evolution. Everybody at Ohio State says, oh, he's the best one. He's the best one. Nathan, do you think Jackson Smith-Njigba healthy would have been a better NFL draft prospect than Garrett Wilson? Because we sometimes, and by we, I mean Steven, we think a receiver's good, and then as soon as the next receiver's here, we're like, nope, it's that receiver. And then it was like, nope, it's that receiver. Nope, it's that receiver. Why? Now, we know the results. Garrett went higher than Jackson Smith-Njigba. Do you think in the end that was primarily an injury concern, Nathan, with Jackson? I mean, basically didn't play his last year.
Nope.
And in your mind, is there any consideration of like, oh, no, I think Jackson Smith-Njigba might be the best draft prospect at receiver in Ohio State history?
I really don't know how much the injury was still an issue by draft day. Because much in the same way as with Nick Bosa several years before that, they'd had time to prove their health. And Smith-Njigba had proved his health. I mean, he had a great combine. He was good at Ohio State's pro day. He didn't run like special numbers, but he ran a healthy number, and he obviously all of his route running, he was able to go out and go through the full complement of pressures and stresses and all the things that they put him through and came out fine. So I think he had answered the health issues primarily by draft day. I think there are still issues about, again, if you're comparing him head to head with Garrett Wilson, guys who made their initial name in the slot and then changed things up a little bit. And Jackson Smith-Njigba never got that chance. I think he is still seen as primarily a slot weapon going into the NFL, whereas I think Garrett Wilson was just seen as a better all-around talent. And that, I think, is reflected in why he went so much higher than Smith-Njigba did in his class.
And again, we slice it thin. Draft prospect is not the same thing as productive college receiver, not best receiver
Sure.
in the Ohio State offense, best receiver for what Ohio State wants to do and how they want to attack people, and then best is viewed by the NFL. I do think Garrett's a little more dynamic, versatile, like just a little bit of everything. So to be clear, you guys are firmly on the idea of Garrett Wilson to this point is the best receiver draft prospect in Ohio State history.
Yeah, and I think the difference between him and some of the other guys on this list is the complete package that he was. Like, I think Jackson should be considered, but he's not a burner. He's not like Garrett lit it up at the combine with that time, and then he's a guy. He's a number one X receiver in the NFL. I don't know if Jackson Smith-Njigba is that, and he might prove me wrong because you don't have to be a burner to be a dominant X receiver, just like you don't have to be Marvin Harrison Jr. to be an X receiver. But the prospect part of what's the difference between Garrett Wilson and Jackson Smith-Njigba is where Garrett would have won out, which is why Jackson in his draft, teams waited to the 20s, while teams kind of jumped at Garrett in the top 10.
Which is why I don't think I ever agreed with the idea of like, oh, everybody at Ohio State says Jackson's better than Chris and Garrett. It's like, I don't think I ever thought that was true. I don't know that I ever thought Jackson Smith-Njigba was better than Garrett Wilson. Like, whatever better means. And I guess better means, who would you take? I would always take Garrett Wilson. So that's not what Ohio State says. I don't think it's what we've always said here, but also this is not who I would have picked. So this is a difficult thing in Ohio State history. The first receiver taken in the first round, like pure receiver, is Joey Galloway in 1995. And there are 3 Cooper receivers that are just, they're not forgotten, but it's not right now. Like, so much of what Ohio State receivers are feels of right now. And it makes it, this isn't like going back into the 60s, but from a passing standpoint, it almost feels like it is. So you have to think about Joey Galloway, the 8th pick in 1995, Terry Glenn, the 7th pick in 1996, and David Boston, the 8th pick in 1999. You have to think about it. You have to at least think about it. And I went back in the Wayback Machine and I was watching highlights and I was reading stuff. And I did come to this shorthand. To me, Joey Galloway is Terry McLaurin. Like, more speed, a little smaller, but like fast as all get out. I thought Terry Glenn was almost like a really good combination of Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, because I thought he had some of the after the catch stuff of Garrett, but was a deep threat like Chris Olave. And then I thought David Boston looked like what if Terrell Pryor had played receiver at Ohio State. And I think David Boston is the best NFL receiver prospect in Ohio State history. And maybe it's just the 90s shoulder pads. But if you go back and watch a David Boston highlight reel like I did, he is a monster. He catches deep balls. He catches short balls and is an after the catch maniac. He catches balls in traffic. He returns kicks and punts. He looks like he will either run past you or run over you, and it doesn't really matter to him. He is ridiculous. And in terms of being a number one guy in his draft, Torrey Holt was the number one receiver picked in his draft. And whatever happened to Torrey Holt, I don't even know what happened to that guy. Greatest show on turf. He's a maniac. He was an NFL superstar. So Torrey Holt was great. Going into that draft, there was a debate. Is David Boston the number one receiver? I think when you read stuff afterward, some people said David Boston should have been the number one receiver. It is a rare package of skills. He's like 6'2", like 215, like just really big and physical and fast. Now, he was good in the league. He also had off-field things in the league that kind of derailed him from reaching his maximum potential as an NFL player, Nathan. But I think when you lump a lot of the guys together, and I'll do my David Boston spiel now because like I'm going to take him at some point in this draft.
No, you're not.
Good. I feel good about that. But like when I was thinking about, like, I just thought from a raw physical specimen standpoint, because Garrett's not gigantic. Garrett has a catch radius. Garrett plays bigger than he is. David Boston is bigger. So I had, when I made my list for the second half of the draft, I had 3 receivers. I had there's 16 picks we're going to make. I had 19 guys on my list, and I had 3 receivers. And Garrett Wilson was one of them. So I'm not saying like I vehemently disagree with this pick. Garrett Wilson, to me, is the second or third best receiver draft prospect in Ohio State history. I just thought David Boston was the unique guy with all the combination of skills. And man, oh man, was he productive in his final season at Ohio State. So I'm not saying you're wrong, but I think it's a really fun receiver discussion, and it is very difficult to compare guys from the mid-90s to guys from the 2020s. It just is.
And Boston was the second highest receiver on my list, and I thought about it. I think, and ultimately, if you were to make the comparison head to head with Wilson, you could say, well, the Drake London being maybe the more Boston of the two, like you could say that the NFL did prefer the more David Boston player over Garrett Wilson, but it's tough to say that the Falcons pick at 7 speaks for the whole NFL. And I agree with what Steven was saying before, that I think there was a duality of thought there, and probably more than the duality. There's probably teams that had Chris Olave number 1 on their board. I think that was just what the preference of the teams in that small window decided. I think you could make a strong argument that while all those things are true about Boston and London from a physical standpoint, that the more finished all around receiver product was Garrett Wilson.
You know what this entire discussion felt like? When everybody already knows who the team is going to pick, so they just have like the whole discussion of what he is as a prospect before Roger Goodell comes out.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Raj has yielded the stage to you, Stephen Means, for pick 18.
Doom, 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 doom. Please don't sue us for me humming that. The mighty, and with the 6th round pick, what pick is this? Just pick 19? 18. With the 18th pick in the Buckeye Talk Ohio State Ultimate Draft, the Mighty Means select David Boston from the 1999 NFL Draft. And y'all basically just took my notes. You broke into my house, took my notes, came home, and just read down the entire notes. I was going to use that exact Drake London, Garrett Wilson comparison for what Torrey Holt and David Boston were in 1999, where it did kind of feel like preference, and sometimes when there's two guys who are fighting over the top spot and it's not quarterback, sometimes it can just be preference on what you like and what's the best fit for what you're trying to do offensively or defensively. And that's what it felt like, the Rams did when they took Torrey Holt 2 picks before the Cardinals took David Boston. And obviously it didn't work out, but of the guys in the 90s, when you're trying to place them in this room, just physically, especially this 2023 room and the 2022 room because of what the physical makeup is. Take Marv out of it because Marv's an alien. He's not actually from this planet. David Boston's the only one where I looked at those 3 and felt like he could be wide receiver 1 in this room right now. Just physically what he is and what that talent level is and how they would use him. You can move him all around and do a lot of that stuff that they're going to do with Marv. And now maybe not to the maximum that you can do with Marv because Marv's a little bit different. But I could see them doing a lot of the stuff that they might do with Marv this year with David Boston had he grown up now instead of in the 90s.
It's not like David Boston bombed in the NFL. He had some things off the field. His 3rd season in the NFL, he had 175 targets, 98 catches, and he led the league with 1,598 receiving yards. So you saw like what it could be. It just didn't happen for a decade. He had 2 1,000-yard seasons in the NFL, but you saw it. And just to recap again, this idea of where guys went in the draft, as Steven said, Santonio Holmes and Jackson Smith-Njigba were the first receivers in their draft. Joey Galloway in his draft was the second guy. Michael Westbrook from Colorado went first. Terry Glenn was the second guy. Keyshawn Johnson from USC was the overall number 1 pick that year. David Boston went second among the receivers behind Torrey Holt. And then Ted Ginn Jr. was a second receiver because guess who was the first receiver? Calvin Johnson. So we aren't quite there, right? That just like we said with the quarterbacks, Nathan, Ohio State has not yet produced the perfect quarterback draft prospect, although CJ Stroud just went second. So like they're getting there. I don't know that Ohio State has produced the perfect receiver draft prospect yet, because you would say, well, do they have a Larry Fitzgerald? Do they have a Calvin Johnson? And they do. He just hasn't been in the draft yet. Do you think we had this discussion in the first pod, Nathan, like where Marvin Harrison Jr. would fit in? If he does what we think, would Marvin Harrison Jr. at the very least be the first receiver off the board in a draft like this if we were doing this next year instead of now?
I think so, because I think you'll be talking about, again, the way that he'll be talked about going into this next year. I mean, it's already started to happen, the way Joel Klatt has talked about him. Like it's one thing if you are considered the best guy at your position in any given draft, or as we're talking about with London and Wilson, the one perceived by some portion of teams to be that. But when people start talking about you as like, oh, this might be the best receiver who's been in the draft since X number of years, and tracing it back 5, 6, 8 years, whatever it will be at that point, then you're talking about a different kind of prospect. And the fact that he may not, as we did on a previous pod, maybe it doesn't even go in the top 2, 3 picks just because quarterbacks are so valued, or edge rushers or whatever. But that means there's going to be a team that's like ecstatic to get him at number 4 or whatever, because talents like that just don't come along very often. That's the trajectory he's on. Yes, I would say. I think he would have been taken in the first 16 picks.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there's the receiver discussion when it comes to something like this. It's we're in the middle of it. I think that's the difference between this and maybe what Larry Johnson was doing, is that you don't feel like you're in the middle of it as much unless JT does something stupid this year. You feel like you're on the other side of it so you can have a full discussion about it. Marvin, for right now, yes, he would clearly be number 1 of these wide receivers. But in 8 years, he might not be, just because of what Ohio State has coming down the pipeline. Is they have Marvin Harrison Jr.'s.
Yeah, here it is.
Times
here it is.
2.
Here it is.
I know.
Here it
I
is.
know. I know. I know.
He's not even gone. He's
I
not.
know.
He hasn't even played. And you're like, well, I mean, like, wait till Brandon Inniss gets here, and wait till you see Jeremiah Smith.
I love how you know where I'm going. Jeremiah Smith, and then there's a kid by the name of Chris Henry Jr. who lives in Cincinnati, who's a 2026 wide receiver who forced Brian Hartline to offer him as an 8th grader last summer. He'll actually be here on Thursday for a camp again. Those 2 guys are from they're from the Marvin Harrison tree of the type of builder receiver, these bigger receivers who don't sacrifice any of the stuff that you typically see from 6-foot receivers. So that's all. I'm not saying they will be better. I'm not saying they won't be better. I just think this will be a very interesting conversation about Ohio State's receivers in their first round draft picks 8 years from now, when it feels like the run isn't as crazy as it is right now when we're in the eye of the storm. He's set a new standard, and it's going to be interesting to see if other people can continue to raise what that standard is.
Okay, so we have Garrett Wilson at 17 and David Boston at 18. And when we come back, I'll make the 19th pick after this on Buckeye Talk.